Hello, here is book review, Gallic Wars by Julius Caesar. Finally, I'm getting around to doing it. I wanted to research a little bit on YouTube and know the order of the battles and stuff, and even make a video of it. But I think I'll just do that later, man. I just want to go ahead and do the laid back version of it now, and get it over with, so I don't have to feel like I gotta listen to it audiobook over and over again. I've listened to the audiobook like 50 times, and I need to move on, listen to something else. The reason I chose Gallic Wars, I think, should be, if you were to choose one book that is you like, I think that people should choose one book that they just know inside and out, just so that they know, it's like their sample book, so they know how much information is in a certain number of pages, and how books are organized, and just to memorize a book. If it's one book, I choose Gallic Wars, because it shows it illustrates kind of the beginning of the Roman Empire and the beginning of civilization, and the major like conflict between the two types of people in the ancient world, the barbarians and and civilization, and tribal societies versus empire. And I think Julius Caesar himself was a very impressive person, because not only was he pretty much the greatest general ever, but he was also, the greatest politician ever too. And he was a good politician, as opposed to bad. He was very intelligent, but not only all that, but he wrote himself. He was an author himself, and he wrote the story of his own conquests. Imagine if Alexander the Great or Napoleon actually chronicled their own campaigns, So he's a very capable person. And you could tell that he was a very intelligent. The way that he wrote, he explained all of the psychology of all the different players in those wars, and how battles were fought, and tactics and strategy, and history and everything. I mean, he's a smart dude, and it also showed me that back in the past, how people would deify somebody. People would call somebody like the father of the nation, or thanks to this person we have the country, and we have this. And in this day and age, there's so many different players, and behind the scenes, we kind of lose sight of how important some people can be. Like, if there was never a Julius Caesar, there probably never would have been a Roman Empire. Like the Gauls would have just started, Gallia. They would have started their own country in all of France, and there would have been, the Roman kingdom, and then there would have been the French kingdom, and it would have been completely different history, and which is something to speculate all in itself. But because if you would have had any other general in charge of all those troops, I don't think they would have been smart enough to be successful in taking over all of France. They had a lot of close calls, and I think the only way that they managed to be successful was because he just knew exactly what to do. He was very disciplined. His troops, had a lot of faith in him, and they made all the right decisions. For example, Varus, the guy who lost the German province forever for Rome. They had the German province on the east of the Rhine for like 30 years. He was an idiot. He did stuff that Julius Caesar never would have done. Like putting all of his troops into. Hey, Darren. You can come in if you want. All of his troops, and here, hold on. Yeah, so Varus did stuff that Julius Caesar never would have done, like putting all of his troops into the forest to chase after, like, the Germans, Then they got all wiped out. Julius Caesar in the book mentioned that all the time, that's just not what they did. And when they did want to try to run after Gauls in there, he would just send other Gauls to do it. So they'd get cut down, or Germans or something. So yeah, he was very capable. So he wrote the book in third person. He talked about himself in third person, but then he would switch to like our. He talk about like our army as in first person. So he wrote it as though a scribe wrote it or something like that. But he was there a total of 8 years. So he had the time to write it. I mean, I'm kind of surprised why other generals and stuff, like didn't like Alexander the Great didn't at least have scribes write the history of him. I guess they did, but anyway. So the story of the Gallic Wars. They took place between, I think, 58. Well, I guess for 6 years. He was in there for 8 years, I guess, but 58 to 52 BC, or BCE, and it started because there was these. Originally the Republic of Rome. It was called the Republic of Rome, and then after Julius Caesar, it became the Roman Empire, because Julius Caesar made himself an autocrat, which pissed off a lot of the other Romans, and so they killed him, and then it started civil war, and it ended up going to his nephew, who he adopted as his successor, Octavius Augustus, and became a empire. But at the time, it was a republic, but it was pretty much an empire already. It had like when you say Roman Empire, that just means like the Roman autocracy, the Roman kingdom. But it was already pretty much an empire when it was the time of the Republic. It was just a republic. Because they owned like parts of southern day, modern day France, like Aquitaine, and parts of Spain that they had taken from the Carthaginians like 100 years beforehand. And but they didn't have any part of the land of the southern part of France that connected Italy with Spain. So the only way they could get there was through the sea. And they were definitely interested in controlling the land part so that they could get back and forth, make a roads back and forth. But they didn't own it, and they weren't, they didn't have like actual plans to have it. But Julius Caesar was appointed the boss of the province of that part of France, like northern Italy, and Italians. There were kind of three different groups in that area at the time. There were the Celts, who the Romans called Gauls, and the main part of the Celt territory was France, modern day France. And there were also Celts in England, and I think some of them even in Ireland. But there were also like Bretons, more native even, who'd been in England and Ireland longer than that. So the main central part of the where the Celts was in France, and they had arrived in that area in the 600s BC, and genetically they were really similar to the Germans. They were tall, blonde-haired people, just like the Germans. France was, but they were more civilized. They were pretty much on par with Italy in terms of civilization. They had coined money, they had towns, well-developed roads made out of wood. But they weren't as civilized as Italy. Italy was more of a cohesive civilization with centralized government in Rome and controlling all of that territory, and they had better construction out of stones and cement, whereas the Gauls were just tribes. They just lived out of like thatched houses that weren't even on a grid structure really. Or the towns weren't. They were more kind of organically grown that way. Just a bunch of houses thrown in, with like a wooden wall around it. The bigger towns were about 40,000 people, and some of them were on tops of hilltops, like the more military type towns were, and then some of them were next to rivers. And they had walls around them that were made out of big trees that were placed kind of in a crisscross lattice work with rocks thrown in. So they were really strong. You couldn't. They were probably harder to knock down with a battering ram than even a lot of than stone walls. But their structure, their infrastructure was made out of wood, whereas Rome was made out of grids and stone structures, and they had they were more literate generally, less superstitious, more scientific, more methodological, more international. So they had a lot more knowledge about warfare and how to do business and stuff. So they were more civilized than the Gauls. But the Gauls farmed just like the Romans did. So the Gauls were closer to the Romans than the Germans were to the Gauls. The Germans across the Rhine, I think France has like a bunch of rivers and river valleys. So it's a better place to farm corn. And Italy is farther south, so they were more farmers as well. The Germans were farther north and lived more in forests, like hilly forests. So they had a totally different. They were barbarians. They had a totally different structure. They didn't really have as many towns. They were more nomads. They even had laws where they weren't even allowed to farm in a place for more than a year. And they had even an ideological... I've done a video of this, actually, the difference between barbarians and civilization. But when you're talking about the Gallic Wars, this is a really important thing to mention, because it shows why they even happened, why Julius Caesar was interested in fighting and going in there. Because the German way of life, or the barbarian way of life in general, was a big threat to civilization, because those barbarians weren't even interested in living the life of the civilized people. They knew what the life was like, but they knew that if they it's kind of like somebody who lives a really austere life where all they eat is really simple food, and then they know that if they were to start living a more expensive life where you drink alcohol and you eat out and stuff, it's more expensive, and it kind of makes you lazy, even though it's more comfortable, and so it's easy to get sucked into that. And so the Germans were proud of being nomads, because they ate a lot. They got their food from hunting, and they lived in smaller bands, even maybe not even tribes a lot of the time, just bands of just free people who could do whatever they wanted. And so they had a lot of, and this is what Julius Caesar said, they had a lot of like personal conviction and physical strength. And because like when Ariovistus was the first person who Julius Caesar fought was a German, and he was explaining to Julius Caesar, like, you don't want to fight us, we'll kick your ass. I haven't even lived inside for the last 8 years. I'm a barbarian. I've been wandering around. And when Julius Caesar was preparing to fight his first battle against Ariovistus, his troopers, when they started talking about it with the local Gauls and the rumors of the Germans, they actually got scared. And Julius Caesar, they were like crying like babies, and even the seasoned officers were like apprehensive and scared because the rumors of the Germans were like, even if they look at you, you'll like piss your pants just from like making eye contact with them, because they were just terrifying, because they were huge and just really strong. And and so everybody, even the Romans, attributed their strength and their powerful warlike lifestyle to the fact that they were nomads, and they just traveled all over the place, and were constantly fighting each other and fighting wild animals. Back in those days, there were even lions in Europe. Lions existed in Europe until the 1st century. So it was just a wild, place. They wore skins. All they wore was skins with nothing underneath, and they would have like large patches of like just bare skin. They bathed in the rivers, so they were strong with the cold water, and whereas the Romans and the Gauls, they farmed, so they had a lot more sedentary lifestyle, which to normal people is actually a lot more appealing. And once Germans find out about it, it's more appealing to them, and they want to go in there and and only have to work a couple hours a day farming, and then they can just chill out and develop a society and a culture, and trade and educate themselves and just chill out, and so while they were proud of being strong and who they were, there was also that temptation to move in, and it was easy for them to move in to Gaul and take over because they were better warriors. They were physically stronger because they exercised more with the hunting and the running around, and they were better fighters and bigger and stronger. One reason they were the Celts and the Germans were so much taller and even more muscular, bigger, more stoutly built, was because their diet was meat. They hunted, and when your diet is all meat and protein, you're going to get big. The Romans ate grain, like wheat, and so they didn't have much protein, so they were little. They were like, I think they said Julius Caesar about 5'7", which was tall for a Roman, and I think they said that this isn't in the Gallic Wars book, but other sources, that Germans were on average about 6 inches taller. So if your average Roman was say 5'6", your average German was like 6 feet tall, and probably some tribes even taller, like the Dutch. Dutch have a reputation for being really tall because back in those days, and this is actually written in the Gallic Wars, there were the Belgi, so Belgium is kind of like southern Netherlands. Julius Caesar never actually went into modern day Netherlands. That was full on German territory, but the swampy part, they were talking about the swampiness, and those people, the swamp people, the Dutch, they lived off of quail eggs and fish, which is pure protein, which makes you really big. And so that's why the genetic propensity of the Dutch is to get really big, because their ancestors ate fish and quail eggs all the time. And so they that's why there was always, like the Celts moved into France in the 600s BC. And before them, there were probably more sedentary farmers who were taken over. The people who took over France after the fall of the Roman Empire were the Franks. They were another German tribe. So, and then the Huns. Those were and the Mongols. All these badass fighters. They were all nomadic people. So it made you really strong warriors. And the Celts had actually been fighting the Romans for a long time. Back in 398 BC, the Celts actually sacked Rome itself. And after they won, they beat the Romans in a war called the Battle of the River Allia. And the Celts had, like modern day Milan was actually a Celt city in, around the 300s BC. So the Celts, were always threatened to even encroach onto Italy, and so the Italians were really freaked out that maybe the Germans would encroach into Italy, and if they did, they were afraid they would completely wipe out the empire, which was a frightening thing. It was kind of like an Armageddon end of the world type of a proposition, because they didn't read or write, those Germans. They didn't have any culture, so they could just go in and just wipe out all of your history. You wouldn't know anything about the ancient Greeks or the beginning of the kingdom, which was like 250 years, or no, like 700 years beforehand, and just wipe out civilization. So it was something that they're really freaked out about. And so, so this is how the beginnings of the Gallic War started. There was a tribe of Celts who lived in modern day Switzerland, in the valley between the Lake Geneva and the mountains, called the Helvetians, and they were the most badass of all of the Celts, because they had they were right there next to the Rhine River, next to where all the Germans were. So they were fighting the Germans. They were more related to the Germans. As the Germans tried to come into their territory, they'd fight them, and then they would even go into Germany and fight the Germans. And they had their little valley was about 240 by like 180 miles in size, and they thought that they were ready to move. And so this is kind of tribal structure where an entire nation of people actually moved to another place. Imagine like modern day, like the modern day Hungarians, like, yeah, we're going to move our country over to the next country and take over. That's how it was back in those days, tribal society. So that's how the Gauls were more tribal than the Italians. The Italians had already settled into cities, and they, there weren't whole groups of people who were going to migrate. And so they wanted to migrate into Gaul, and so the Italians had some Celtic friends in France. I think they were called the Arverni. Their capital city was Gergovia, I think, and they actually asked the Julius Caesar to help them because they had heard that the Helvetians were planning to move into France, and they didn't. They had kind of like a peace deal with the Romans that the Romans would protect them because they were like friend nations. The Celts and the Italians, the Romans, they traded with each other. Some Romans had even settled in Gaul and in France and were set up shop to do trading, and they they were like neighboring friendly nations. The only difference was the Gauls were more tribal, so they didn't have a central city that controlled the whole rest of the country like Italy did. Italy had Rome, and they controlled everything, which meant they could call on troops. That proved to be the French downfall, and that's how Julius Caesar was able to take them over in the first place. If Julius Caesar had not have been successful in one of those battles, or in his enterprise, Gaul would probably have unified under one leader in one city, just like the Romans. They would have realized by then that they needed a leader who could be autocratic and call on all the different tribes to create an army to fight off a new nation of people, because the Celts were kind of like one nation. But they didn't, and so they were taken over. And so that kind of, gives you a reason of why there's empire in the first place. It's to fight off, barbarians who might want to encroach on you. So that's how it started. Julius Caesar said, no, Helvetians, you can't do it. But the Helvetians had already passed the point of no return. They had burnt all of their houses and all of their forts, which they had 12 forts, and they were going to move, and they burned all their crops so that they would be more motivated to move. Their leader was I guess Ariovistus. I think he kind of identified himself even as a German. The Romans were interested in fighting them back because they didn't want the Germans to move into France and take over all of France and then move into Italy and threaten Italy. So Julius Caesar moved up there. He was in control of, I think, 4 legions, which is about 20,000 troops. He went up there and actually had a meeting with Ariovistus, but Julius Caesar went in there he had a bunch of like Celtic ally tribes up there in that area, but he decided to go and do the meeting with his own troopers, his 10th Legion on horses, because he trusted them. He didn't want to get ambushed and then have his Gallic allies turn on him. Because Julius Caesar knew, and he mentioned this over and over again, that the Gauls would basically always side with whoever they thought was going to win. They didn't really have loyalty towards civilization like the Italians did. They just had loyalty to whoever would help their particular tribe survive. And so he had the meeting with Ariovistus, and so they said, Caesar was like, yeah, you guys can't move in. We have a peace treaty with those, or in a peace agreement with the people, the Arverni, who you're going to try to move in with. take over their land, and I can't let you do that. And Ariovistus said, oh well, we have already conquered them, and we're badass. And if you can beat somebody, then you have the right to conquest. And we have beaten you before, and so if you want to fight us, then you can fight us. And so they had a skirmish, and I think the Romans won. And so then Ariovistus, but they had to break off that first meeting because Ariovistus his men were throwing arrows at the Romans. So the Romans had to break off and run away, and then they had a skirmish and the Romans won. And then the Ariovistus wanted to have another meeting, and Julius Caesar was like, "No way, dude! I already had that one meeting, and you guys tried to kill me with all of your spears," and which pissed off all the Roman army. And so they decided to have a battle, and see, this is where. I think there were maybe like 15 or 20 battles in the Gallic wars throughout that 6 years. He was in there for 8 years, but I think the first battle was like 58, and the last one, Battle of Alesia, was 52 BC. But yeah, the first battle was with Ariovistus, and so Julius Caesar describes the whole thing that, he had his scouts go out and find out where Ariovistus was, and then they'd have the skirmishes with them to test them, and at first, like I said before, they were really freaked out, afraid to fight Ariovistus, and Ariovistus was trying to intimidate him, like, if you want to fight me, I'll kick your ass, because we haven't even lived inside for 8 years, and we just move around. Only thing was, Julius Caesar's army was kind of like that too. Julius Caesar's army were badasses. He had them do forced marches, where they would just march all day and all night. And they could march like 20 miles a day with like 60-pound packs. I mean, these people were bad asses. Those people in the ancient days were badasses. Like, they would put us to shame. Like when the Spartans went to aid the Athenians, they went to Athens in 2 days, which is like 200 miles away. They were hiking 100 miles a day. I mean, it was insane. Almost like unbelievable. And then once they get to camp, they would make these huge trenches, that were like 20 feet wide and 10 feet deep, and then make these huge walls out of timber around their town, and then basically create a town, complete with different sections of it, and on a grid system, like a actual Roman town, only built out of timber and tents. And then they get up and march the next day, and so they were badasses. And they were better fighters overall than the Germans and the Romans, or the Celts, because they had better technology. For example, in the first battle with Ariovistus, they had spears that the Germans didn't have, where they would throw the spear at the Germans with these soft bronze or copper tipped spears, which would break through the thatched shields that the Germans had, and then the Germans couldn't pull them out because they would bend once they hit the armor of the Germans. So the Germans, and they would even like go through like multiple shields, because the Germans would also huddle together and hold their shields up, so it would poke through multiple shields and then bend, and so then they'd have to ditch their shields to fight. And so yeah, the Romans were just really methodical in the way that they fought. They'd throw the shields first when ranged, and then they would get in their Tortuga formation and advance, and then jab them with their 3-foot long or 2.5-foot long Gladius Hispanicus Spanish swords. That that they got the technology from Spain. They got the sword technology from Spain. They got the spear technology, I think, from the Etruscans in northern Italy. They got the cavalry technology from the Etruscans, and the spear technology from somebody, and then they used pikes, and they just had it all figured out. And Caesar was brilliant. He was very methodical, and so they ended up kicking the Helvetians' asses, and they all had to run, and they all had to escape across a river, and he pretty much wiped him out, because the Romans' army in general was just really pissed off at Ariovistus for for attacking Caesar when he did his meeting with Ariovistus, for threatening him and all this kind of stuff. So when the Roman army got pissed off, they got punitive, and they murdered a couple of Ariovistus's daughters. And I guess Ariovistus escaped, and I guess he ran back into Germany and never to be seen from again. But before that happened, Caesar tried to send, and this is what Caesar says. When you read the book, Caesar portrays himself as just the smartest dude ever. Like, he could just see through everybody, and he never made a mistake or anything. But what Caesar claims is that after the first meeting, he sent in, one of Ariovistus's allies, who was also an ally of Caesar, and a couple of Caesar's own generals, to talk to Ariovistus again, because Ariovistus wanted to meet with Caesar. But Caesar didn't want to do it himself. He just sent some of his guys in. So he sent some of his guys in. And as soon as Ariovistus saw him approaching camp, he said, "Oh, you're trying to be the spy." So he captured him, wouldn't even talk to him. And they drew lots 3 times to see if they would burn him at the stake. Burning at the stake was a Celtic tradition. Like the Wicker Man, burning people inside the Wicker Man and that kind of stuff. Crucifixion was a Roman tradition. So I guess the Romans were a little bit more cruel than the Celts. But when they defeated Ariovistus's army, he retrieved his generals, his friends, and that's when they told him that they were going to burn him, and so which pleased Caesar. And but before Ariovistus, before they had that battle, and Caesar had the meeting, he actually built a trench from the Lake of Geneva to the mountains of north of it, where another tribe were, to actually physically block Ariovistus from escaping. But they breached the walls, and they fought him all off. And that was the first battle, which they beat Ariovistus. And that's when Ariovistus gathered all of his strength and fought him and got his ass kicked. And so that was pretty much the first decimation of Celts. At the end of the Gallic Wars, about a fifth of the entire population was killed off. There were about 5 million Celts in France before Julius Caesar's time, and they killed about 1 million Celts. And then, of course, repopulated with the families of the troops and other Romans moving in, and that's when it became part of the Roman Empire. So there was a genocide. A lot of the tribes were completely wiped out, like the Veneti in modern day Galicia. And the Helvetians were pretty much totally wiped out. When they took over all of Helvetia and they went through their inventory, they found the inventory, the actual written inventory of the Helvetians, of 350,000 people. That's how big the nation was, of the people who were trying to migrate over. Of which there was maybe like half of them were probably fighting technology. Or fighting people. The women generally, I don't think, fought, although they fought more. The Germanic women would fight more than the Italian ones. And like their story of, like when Germans would do raids into Italy, they could just like grab the Italian women and just carry them off, like men would carry someone off. So that they were, I guess, as badass as men, but there's no stories of that. And Julius Caesar's stories, it was all women like not fighting, and then like when their cities got besieged, they would get their tits out and like pray to spare them and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, they had that fight, and so and Julius Caesar did it with the help of a lot of the Gallic tribes, the Arverni. But after that, a lot of the Celts freaked out and thought that the Romans were going to attack the rest of France. I forgot to say though that the documents of the census of the Helvetians was written in Greek. So like the advanced people, the intelligent, the educated class could read and write. The Celts had an educated class called the Druids. And they were the ones who could read and write, and they were their own class. Like they didn't have to, they got like a state stipend. They didn't have to work or anything like that, and The big thing that the Celts were really into, probably because they lived farther north than the Romans, was astronomy. They knew a lot about astronomy and astrology, because the days got longer in the summertime and shorter in the wintertime, but Julius Caesar says that they were like religious about it. They were fanatical about it. Like he was even a little bit derogatory about it. Like they would be too much slaves to the astronomy and all that kind of stuff, astrology, and like their whole lives revolved around it. Another interesting thing is, before the Helvetians had the fight against the Romans, the women actually decided when to have the fight. There are these certain, and I guess it was the Druid women. They like drew lots or something, or they did a divination or something, and they decided that the Helvetians weren't going to be successful if they fought before the next full moon, so they had to wait. And so that's kind of where the women's power came in. And I think in more primitive, more tribal societies, the women have more power than in the more civilized societies in the ancient world, because in the ancient world, what made the world go around were the big armies, and the armies were only consisted of men. Julius Caesar's army was all dudes, and they're all badasses who their only goal was to fight and to march and to follow Julius Caesar's order like he was God, which made them extremely dangerous to farming people who thought that they were badass. I mean, they were bigger and stronger than the Romans, like genetically, but one-on-one, the Romans could kick a Gaul's ass, even though he was smaller, because they were just they could hike 20 miles a day with 60-pound packs. They were beasts. Like, for example, how you have in the TV show Spartacus, where you would have the gladiator fight all the Romans, and he could just cut down Roman after Roman. Well, that's actually true. There's a huge difference between a professional fighter, when you're talking about sword and hand-to-hand combat, and just like a Gallic farmer. There were lots of stories, like specific stories. Julius Caesar was really good in his Gallic wars about mixing psychology, why people made decisions, strategy, and then bringing in specific stories. So yeah, there are a lot of specific stories of like a Roman guy, going out there and killing a bunch of guys before he finally got killed. And one story was Varenus and Pullo. If you've seen the HBO miniseries of Rome, and remember the two central characters, Pullo and Varenus. Well, those characters were based off of just a short anecdote from Julius Caesar from one of the later battles. I can't remember what battle it was, though. It was, I think it was a siege, one of these sieges where the Gauls were besieging one of the Roman strongholds, and there were all these Romans behind the gates, and there were Pullo and Varenus, and they were both competing with each other, like who was braver to try to get the promotion. And Pullo ran out and said, "Hey, Varenus, if you're so badass, then you should follow me and fight." So they actually ran out into a multitude of Gauls, and Pullo killed a couple of them, like a gladiator would in the Spartacus. Wow. And then Varenus ran out, and then he got his. They threw a spear at him, and it hit his scabbard and made it so that twisted it around and made it so he couldn't get his sword out. Or stuck his sword and he was surrounded by like a bunch of Gauls who were about to cut him down, and then Varenus jumped out and fought him back and killed a couple of them himself, and then ran after him, but then he fell down on a downhill, and then all of the Gauls by then had abandoned Pullo, didn't even bother to kill him because they thought he was already dead, and then Varenus was about to get killed by a bunch of them, but then Pullo jumped up and killed a bunch of them, and then they killed a few, and then they ran back in as heroes, So that kind of shows you like how much more badass Romans were. I mean, these Roman soldiers, if they weren't hiking with huge packs on and digging huge trenches, they were practicing their thrusts and all of the different martial artist moves that they had. And I mean, they were badasses. Whereas the Gauls were just a bunch of hot-headed farmers who thought that they could kick ass just because they were bigger. And And yeah, and so like one thing that Julius Caesar also mentioned over and over again was that the Gauls were like they were impetuous and were like they were very impetuous. They would all like they would do stuff without like thinking about it. Like they were like mob mentality. Like if they thought that they could fight off the Romans, they would all clump together immediately and then just attack without thinking about it, and get their ass kicked. And he said it so much, and he said it a way that I believe him. I think Romans were just a lot more because they had that autocracy, the general who made all the decisions, and based off of scientific knowledge about everything. They were more successful, and there were a couple of occasions when the troopers didn't listen to Julius Caesar, like they would attack anyways. For example, the second to last battle when they besieged Gergovia, which was one of these hilltop forts, the Romans were going to advance on the city, and then Julius Caesar looked at it and saw that there were way too many Gauls up on top of the hill on the other side of the wall, and the Romans were, by the time they'd finally get there, they'd be tired out from climbing the hill, and there wouldn't be enough of them. And so he signaled the horn to make them retreat, and they didn't listen to it. And it ended up killing 700 Roman soldiers, and they had to retreat and weren't able to besiege the city. And Julius Caesar blamed it on his men, saying, you have to listen to me. If you don't listen to me, we're not going to win. And the same thing happened, before the very first battle with Ariovistus, where they didn't want to fight, and he said, "Look, trust me, we can beat them. We've done the skirmishes, and the skirmishes actually turn out in our favor. They're not as badass as they say they are." So anyways, after Julius Caesar defeated the Helvetians, the rest of the Celts kind of freaked out and thought that now the Romans are going to try to take over the rest of France. And I think the Romans decided, that was their best time to take over the southern part of France, so that they could at least get the coastal part of southern France, so that they could connect Italy to Spain. And he defeated. I guess that was the next war. I'm not totally clear on the exact order of the wars and the names of the battles and everything, but Julius Caesar was able to beat the French again because he could call on the aid of the Aquitanians, which were tribes, which were Roman outposts, colonies and Celtic tribes that were friendly to Rome in the Aquitanian area, and fought them and won. And then some more Gauls would band together and try to fight. And so Julius Caesar then had some wars against the Veneti, who live in that peninsula that juts out just south of England, the peninsula of France, in modern day Galicia. They were called the Veneti, and they were the ship builders. They were really good at naval stuff. And so Julius Caesar described their boats really well. The Gauls had these really big, really high, big boats that had really rounded bottoms to them, and their sails were built out of animal hides instead of cloth that the Romans ships used. The Roman ships used faster ships that had more of a deep ridge in the bottom, deep hull, sharp hull, that were sails that had cloth sails, but they also were rowers, so they could go faster. Similar to the Greek catamarans. I think they originally got their technology from the Carthaginians, who were originally settled by the Phoenicians, who were related to the Greeks. So they had kind of those Greek-looking ships. And they tried to ram they had the spike just like the Greeks did. They tried to ram the Veneti ships, but they weren't successful because those Veneti ships were just built really sturdily with bolts that were as thick as a man's thumb, with these huge timbers cross-beam timbers on them that were built really high, so they couldn't throw spears and kill the people with spears because they were higher than the Roman ships. But the Romans ended up defeating them anyways because they figured them out really quickly. I think they boarded them and jumped on the ships and could beat them in hand to hand. And the Veneti were another one of those tribes who they pretty much wiped out completely. Because when the Romans have a difficult time of defeating somebody, they get and the longer a war gets protracted, and this holds true with sieges as well. The more pissed off they get, and the more they desire to just kill everybody when they finally win the battle. So that's what happened. They got a little bit offended that they were having trouble in the beginning with the Veneti. So by the time they beat them, they just killed them all. And that was across the water from England. So that's when Julius Caesar went across into I think with like a 2 legions or something. And he would station a couple legions back in France. He went across into England just to check out England. They already knew beforehand that England was a triangular-shaped island, and they knew pretty much how big it was. But that's all they knew. And the other Gauls didn't even know that much about England. It's interesting because it goes to show like how little people knew about each other in those days. I mean, there was a lot less knowledge about the world in general back in Celtic days as there was in the Dark Ages. All they knew was that there were some traders who did trade with them, but they didn't really know anything. So he wanted to just check it out. So he went across in 40 transports, I think he even mentioned how many people could fit in a transport boat. But they went across and they made it there. And when they boarded, all of the Brits were waiting for them because the Brits knew they'd come over, and I think they even sent envoys or something before they went. But because it's only like 20 miles, the English Channel. But all the Brits were waiting for them, and they had to find a good place to dock. There were a lot of cliffs, and when they finally did board, they were all waiting for them and were fighting them, and were like going into the water on their horses. And the Romans were scared because it was kind of unfamiliar territory. Julius Caesar mentioned a lot that Romans did really well, and how important that Romans valued fighting on their terms, like on something that's familiar. That's why they never, when they would beat the Celts in a battle, they would never run after them. When they all ran off into the forest to hide, they would never run after them because Romans would always only want to fight in an open field where they could form their cohorts in in those square formations and stay together and not break their methodology. And even when Julius Caesar marched into France, and at one point he took like 100-mile detour just so that they wouldn't have to pass through any forests or anything, so that they could stay in open country the whole time and not get ambushed. That kind of goes to show how smart Julius Caesar was and how dumb Varus was. Who lost their German province 80 years later. So they were kind of not really familiar fighting the Brits as they were kind of fighting them on their ships. But and then one really brave standard bearer. I guess the standard bearers, those are the guys who hold the. In more modern times, they would hold flags, but in those days, they would hold big wooden or big golden eagles that were on top of big pikes, just to show the general who's looking from afar where all of his troopers were. And then so he could direct them where to go. And the standard bearer was one of the it was an honor to hold the standard. It meant that you were brave because you could run around and lead your troops. He'd be like, because when they would tell a division of troopers to go somewhere, they tell the standard bearer to go, and then the standard bearer runs and everybody follows him. So the standard bearer says, "Well, I don't know about you guys, but I'm going to do my job to my country and my general. So follow me if you want, but I'm going." So he jumps off the boat onto the land where all the bad guys were, and then they all got heart, had the courage to jump off and follow him, and they ended up beating the Brits and making them run back, and they set up camp, and And then all the Brits, sent envoys. Oh my God! Okay, we give up. What do you want us to do? So they sent a bunch of hostages. Every time the Romans would win a battle, and not just the Romans, but even the Celts with each other and the Germans with each other, the people who lose would have to send family of the nobility over into the custody of the winning side as a sign of honor and a reason to not rebel. So they sent hostages. But there was this really big storm, which destroyed like a whole bunch of Roman ships, like half the Roman ships or something, and they didn't have a whole lot of extra food because they weren't expecting to be there that long, and they didn't expect to get thrashed by the storm. The Roman the Roman boats weren't really designed for the northern climes. The northern bearing the English Strait, and this is why the Spanish Armada was defeated by the English also. It's just different water conditions. It's a really choppy water, and there was a lot of like shallow water, people going up the riverbeds and stuff. So the Roman ships were designed to just go really fast on flat water. So they were getting thrashed around on these big waves, and they got destroyed, thrashed up against the rocks. And even, after they had the first fight with the Veneti, they actually redesigned their ships to be more like the French ships by importing wood from Aquitania, which is the part of France that Rome owned. So he was mentioning, how convenient it was to have an empire and be able to draw on the resources of tribes that were loyal to him. And since the tribes didn't really communicate with each other that well, once he subdued a tribe, they were his, and they were loyal to him. And even if they didn't want to be loyal, they saw him as a big guy, and if they tried to fight against him, he'd just kill them all. So yeah, he imported when he lost his ships and had to rebuild a fleet, and where the Veneti land was in Galicia, they imported a bunch of wood from Spain and Aquitania, and but yeah, so they were stuck in England, and the Brits new tribes stopped sending more hostages in, and so Julius Caesar took that to mean that they were planning another rebellion. Which turned out to be true, because they could tell that Julius Caesar was always mentioning what the other side was thinking and why they did what they did. They were because they could see that the Romans they had a very small baggage train, because they were only planning on being there a little bit, so they had a deceptively small camp, which made them not very intimidating to the English, to the Brits, which made them want to fight back. Because they didn't have that much of a cavalry, they didn't have all the baggage or ships anymore, and so the Romans had sequestered some corn fields that they were getting their food from, and Julius Caesar sent like a legion or something out there to get the corns and when the guys had set down their armor and picking corns, they got ambushed by a bunch of Brits. Ran out from the trees to try to kill him, who had been waiting there at that cornfield expecting him to come. And Julius Caesar or his scouts saw a bunch of dust off in the distance where the cornfields were, and so he guessed that they were getting attacked. So he sent the rest of his guys out there to fight him, and fought him off and saved his guys and brought him back. And I think they had another attack by the Brits, but then they fought the Brits back and they subdued him. But then Julius Caesar went back to France, and he never went back to England. So Julius Caesar wasn't the person who took over England for Rome, because England was in the Roman Empire. It was under Emperor Claudius, who came like 100 years later. But by the time Julius Caesar returned back to France after being there, I don't know, I don't even know how long he was there, but he talked about more about the battles when he had the fights with the Brits. The Romans had a more difficult time fighting the Brits than they did fighting the Gauls, because the Brits used different fighting techniques. The Brits relied heavily on like individual cavalry and on chariots. they would. He even described how that, like the chariots would rush in really fast. The guy would jump off the chariot and like throw a spear at the guys and fight, and then jump back on the chariot, and then take off. And so it made it difficult for the Romans, because the Romans couldn't pursue the chariots when they ran away, and the Romans couldn't really form a fighting division really quickly when they came up on them. So it threw them off guard. But they ended up doing well and defeating the Brits. So anyways, by the time they get back to France again, the French had organized another rebellion, different tribes who used to be loyal now turned bad, and they had another couple of battles. But I think after he returned, he went back to Italy to try to ask for more troops or to settle some dispute. And then while Julius Caesar was in Italy, that's when they had, I think, the final uprising under Vercingetorix, who was I think he was from Alesia. There were lots of different tribes in France, but the two big ones were the Arverni and the Aduans, Aduan and Averni. The capital of Averni was Gergovia, and the capital of the Aduans was oh man, I can't remember, Bibracte. And so they had I think Vercingetorix was in Arverni, which is in like modern day, like I guess Arverna, I don't know. But he was in Italy, and then they heard that he was in Italy, and they heard that he was in Italy because they were having internal strife. So they figured that they could band together and fight the Romans off, and so Vercingetorix he was a young guy who got whose father tried to be king in all of France as well. Like there has been a history of guys trying to take over all of France, to unite France, and it just never worked. They were too tribal. So he gathered a bunch of different, like tribes together to fight. And I think they took over some Roman areas. And Julius Caesar had to fight back, had to get back there really quick to fight. But he didn't want to, he didn't really know how to get back there because he had to pass through hostile territory. They didn't have total control of the part of France that was between Italy and France. So he had to. He didn't want to have his army go down and get him, because he didn't want his army to march without him. Like he didn't trust anybody to control his army but him. He was like, he wanted to be in charge of everything, and which kind of shows how capable he was. So I think he ended up managing to march back into France with his own army, like an army that the Italians gave him. Although he was having trouble getting more troops from Italy because they were kind of getting, I guess, intimidated by his power. But he ended up making it back into France, and then he fought Vercingetorix. So this was like the final battles in the Gallic Wars. I don't know, I can't remember if Avaricum came before or after Gergovia or Bibracte, but I think it was after. So they went and they tried to they won some battles, and then they tried to take over Bibracte, which was one of these hilltop forts, and that's where the 700 Romans died, and they kind of abandoned that. And then so Vercingetorix had his own army of, I guess, probably about as many guys as Julius Caesar's army, who were kind of running away from Julius Caesar, and Vercingetorix was kind of doing one of these scorched earth campaigns where he would burn down all the fields, the crops of corn, so that the Romans couldn't go there and gather it up and feed themselves. And then he went on the other side of one of those big rivers in France and then burnt down the bridges. So they did have a good network of bridges as well. And then tore down the bridge so that the Romans couldn't cross. But that was after Avaricum. So they failed taking Bibracte, and then they went over to this town called Avaricum. But Vercingetorix went to Avaricum first and said, "Hey, Avaricum," and I don't know what tribe they were, but it was one of those big cities, about 40,000 people, and they said, "Hey, you guys need to join our army and burn down your entire city and all the stores, so that when these Romans come, they can't take you over and replenish themselves." And the people at Avaricum were like, "No way, we're not going to destroy our city. We can defend it ourselves. Screw you." And he was like, "All right." So he left, and the Romans came and did a siege on Avaricum by like building these really big trenches, like like 10 feet deep by like 20 feet wide, with big, like with that would go between one camp of where the Romans were and another camp that was like a quarter mile away, where they could go between each other and not get hit by spears or arrows from the French. So I mean, it's amazing what the Romans did. And there's another thing. Early on in the war, after he defeated the Helvetians in the beginning, Julius Caesar actually he crossed the Rhine and went into Germany for 18 days. He built a bridge across the Rhine and described how he designed it too. If you type in Julius Caesar's bridge across the Rhine, they have diagrams of it because he described it to a T. They built these big piles into it and had it so that when the current came down, it would make it even stronger and firm it up, and marched like his whole army across, where they just burned fields and burned towns and for like 18 days, and then crossed back into like France, and then tore down their bridge just to scare the shit out of all of the Germans. And when he crossed, they did, like, most of the Germans just ran for the hills, and a couple of them sent embassies, like ambassadors, like, whoa, we're your friends, we'll help you. And he did that just to scare them and to show them that not to fuck with Rome. But he built that entire bridge in 10 days. And I remember seeing a documentary, and somebody was like, one of the historians was like, there's no way an army of people these days could even build that. Like, those guys all they did was work. And another thing that made his army so strong is he did forced marches where they marched day and night. Like, they would get, if they found out that there was a rebellion somewhere, he would just get his army there quick. Like, boom, they'd be there overnight, and then they just knock them out, wipe them out, and they could cross rivers a lot faster. I mean, passes a lot faster than Gallic armies could. He mentioned, or I think even like Ariovistus, the German armies, he mentioned how, like, it'd take the German army or one of his enemy armies, a month to cross over a pass with the same size of army, and he did it in like a week or something, So, so anyways, so they were badasses. So they built one of these trenches between two strongholds in Avaricum, and they held out a siege that lasted a while, which pissed off the Romans. The Romans were shooting catapults into the Avaricum and killing a bunch of all the people who were manning the walls, all the French manning the walls. And Julius Caesar did mention a bunch of times complimenting how badass the Gauls were. Like, for example, the Germans or the Romans started a big fire on one of the walls of Avaricum, and so they had all these Gauls go out to put out the fire, and only he was in the line of sight of the catapults, who could shoot the small pistols, and they would like pierce the guy and kill him, and he'd drop dead, and then the other guy would replace him until he could drop dead over and over again, and then they put out the fire. And he actually mentioned that one reason that the French were so apt, they had so many different rebellions, and it was easy to get them all to band together to fight against the Romans, was because they considered themselves the best fighters in the world, like better than the Romans. They used to they had a reputation of being the best fighters. Probably from 500, 600 years beforehand, when they actually invaded France and killed all the people who were there before, whoever it was, and then when they won the battles against the Romans, and so now that they're getting beaten by like little Romans. For example, he had one story where they were going to besiege a town. I don't remember which one it was, but it was one of the earlier towns. I think it may even been the Helvetians, but. Yeah, they're going to besiege a town. They built some huge, one of those towers that rolls on wheels, where they build the tower really high, so that all they have to do is push it up against the wall, and then they can just jump on the wall. And as they're pushing the tower towards the wall, all the Gauls were like, what's this? We're not afraid of that thing. Those puny Germans, or those puny Romans, those short Romans with the little hands and the little muscles. But then it got closer, and they said, "Whoa, we've never seen that before, ever. What is that? Oh my God, okay." And then they actually gave up. They gave up the town and sued for peace before they even had to fight, before they even brought the tower next to them. So yeah, the Germans, the Romans had a lot more battle technology than the French, or I'll call them Celts, or I'll call them Gauls. And the Gauls, over time were starting to quickly adopt the techniques of the Romans. For example, the Gauls were besieging one of these Roman strongholds. I think it was when Julius Caesar was in England. Cicero was the general of one of these forts, and they were besieged by the Gauls, and the Gauls had built one of the towers that they had learned to make from the Romans, and I think they had attacked them because there was actually a tribe of Germans who had crossed over. Maybe this was up in north, because the Belgians were another one of these. They were called Belgicae in modern day Belgium, who were these kind of like Celts or Gauls who were really similar to Germans, like Celts, like the ones in the southern Netherlands, the ones who lived off of quail eggs, and like the tribal ones, who were total badasses, and so they were going to go and try to come in and fight, and they asked even other Germans to try to help them, but the Germans said, "No way, we tried once, we've heard about those Romans, we're not gonna help you." So going into Germany and then those punitive measures was actually maybe even directly caused the other Germans to be afraid to fight and actually helped them. But so yeah, the Belgicae were fought and I think besieged one town because they were told that there were some Romans in there who were afraid to leave, and there was a mistake where there was one smarter Roman general in there who just wanted to hold up and wait until Julius Caesar came, and Julius Caesar actually got a friendly Celt spy to go in amongst the Celts who were besieging it and throw a spear with a piece of paper that told him that Julius Caesar was only 3 days away, and they saw it 3 days later. It was lodged in the wicker wall. And they said, "Oh, cool! They're going to come," and they came and they relieved him. But I think there was another siege, or that was Cicero. But there was another siege where one of the Romans was like, they wanted to run, and the other guy said, "No, stay." But the guy who wanted to run to try to go to the other, bridge the gap to the other stronghold or whatever to meet up with the other Romans, won the argument. And so they were marching in one of these slow single file kind of formations, and they got attacked by a bunch of Gauls, and the guy who wanted to, the stupid general who wanted to leave, didn't know what to do. He was running around asking people to form and do this, and in a way that showed he didn't know what he was doing. And the one who wanted to stay, the smarter general, said, "Okay, you do this," and because he was smarter and actually had expected to get attacked. And so they huddled up in their formations, and they managed to fight off the Gauls on that occasion. But but yeah, there's lots of this is a book that if you were to listen to, it'd take you 7.5 hours to get through. It's a big book. I don't know how many pages it was, but I think the last chapter was actually written posthumously by somebody else that Julius Caesar had dictated. But anyways, so they had the failed siege on Gergovia, and then they had Bibracte, and then they had they besieged Avaricum, which was modern day, I can't remember, but it's one of these flat cities next to a river, and they besieged him. And when they finally broke through the walls, that's when all the women were got their tits out and were pleading in in a French way. I don't know what they did, put their hands together, "Oh, please don't hurt us," or whatever. But the Romans were pissed off, and they jumped in, and a bunch of and they all got on the walls surrounding the city, looking down, and all of the men huddled into the middle of the city together to wait for the Romans to jump down so they could fight them. But then they kind of freaked out and saw that they were outnumbered, so they all ran for the gates to try to get out to save themselves, where they all bottlenecked each other and then got cut down by the Romans. And Julius Caesar mentioned this over and over again, how the Gauls just had mob mentality. Like, it was really easy for them to mount an attack on the Romans, even when it was against when it was like bad circumstances for them, like bad footing, bad ground, or because they didn't have enough people gathered, and then they would all give up and run off like in a mob. So, it was a lot less organized than the organized autocratic army system of Julius Caesar. I'm sure if you went to like West Point College, any military historian, I bet you the first book they would ask you to read would be the Gallic Wars by Julius Caesar. So anyways, when they took over Avaricum, they jumped in and they slaughtered everybody. They killed all the women, all the old people, all the children, and all of the citizens. Only 800 of them escaped into the tribe of to the stronghold of where Vercingetorix and all of his guys were in the woods, hiding from the Romans. And he said, "Okay, you guys go into the tribes." He had all the different tribes organized in different areas, and because they lost that battle, but it didn't, like Julius Caesar said, usually when a side loses a battle, then they would blame it on the general. But this actually made Vercingetorix more of a authority amongst them, because he actually warned them. He tried to get them to burn down Avaricum, but they didn't. And so they said, "Okay, yeah, our bad." And so then Vercingetorix was running away from Julius Caesar. That's when they went on the other side of the river, burned down the bridges. So Julius Caesar is kind of like following Vercingetorix on one side of some big river, which they couldn't ford, and Vercingetorix's army is on the other side, just like kind of running away from him, waiting for all of his other reinforcements to come. And but then Julius Caesar did a fake out move where he made one of his columns follow Vercingetorix, but in a more spread out formation. So Vercingetorix didn't notice that his whole army wasn't there, and then the other army actually went back up, rebuilt a bridge, and then crossed over, and then went down and attacked Vercingetorix, and so which made Vercingetorix run for the hills, which was a hilltop fort, Alesia, where he boarded himself up in this town with a whole bunch of people, and then the Romans went there and built this wall that enclosed Vercingetorix's entire town, and the wall was like 13 miles around, built out of this huge wall, on the inside, and then built another wall on the outside, circling it. So because they were expecting another like 80,000, or I guess it was like, I don't know how many thousand. Vercingetorix was maybe 40,000 troops. Caesar's troops were like 40,000, and then Caesar had had a bunch of allied tribes, like the Boii were an allied tribe who always supported Julius Caesar. And they were waiting for all these other tribes to come in and aid and attack the Romans. So they built walls on both sides, and they also built a huge trench on the outside that was like 20 feet across by like 10 feet deep. And then they on the outside of the trench, because the Romans would be on top of this huge wall. I mean, this isn't just a wall. This is like a wall and then a big fort every like half mile or whatever, so they could shoot missiles at the Gauls. And they had this big like killing field of all of these. I think the Romans called them tulips, which was these big stumps of logs that they would then hammer in spikes, iron spikes, and then throw them in like 3 foot deep holes that they dug, and then covered them up with leaves and like twigs, and had those placed like every 3 feet or something, so that when the whole masses of all the Gauls ran in to get him, they'd fall in and die and like get impaled on all of these like spikes, which would stick like 3 inches out of the logs. And then they had like all these other booby traps and stuff, and yeah. So Vercingetorix is there up there on the top of the hill, like like saying like, look at those Romans. These guys mean business. They're not going to be building that for nothing, for no reason, and sent for the reinforcements now. But they couldn't communicate with all of the tribes on the outside, so they couldn't have a coordinated attack against the Romans. So when the tribes did come to fight the Romans, they kind of all ran all together, big mobs, and the Romans went and fought them, and it was one of these battles that started, I guess, at noon and was going into the night, lasted for like 6 hours, and it was like even, and then Vercingetorix sent his guys down to fight, and but this was after actually they ran out of food, and they sent all the women and old people out of the city because they didn't have food for them, to try to go into the Roman camp and have the Romans like feed them. But Julius Caesar said, "We're not going to feed you. We don't have the resources. So nobody let him in. So they're like, all of the people in this town, all the women and old men in this town died, starved to death in like no man's territory between the Roman area, which was like 13 miles around, and around the entire hill bottom, and they located the hill and the town. But I think Vercingetorix was trying to get him to eat them, because there was another story like there was some other siege and where some other German tribe had besieged a town, maybe it was the same town, where they actually ate their old men and the women and stuff to feed themselves so that they could survive the siege. But they didn't do it that time for some reason. I guess they were more civilized. And they just let them all die. And so then all of those tribes finally came, and the Romans beat them, and then Vercingetorix and his guys came down and fought. And then Julius Caesar had his last division of guys, and then he sent them all down all together, and he put on his big red cloak signifying who he was, and went down and fought himself, which gave all of the Romans like more heart to fight, knowing that this is the final battle, like now's the time to fight. And they fought, and it freaked out all the French, and the French ran for the hills back to their tribes, and it was over. And so Vercingetorix and his guys had to run back to the top of the hill, and then he was like, "All right, I lose. What do you guys want to do? You're going to kill me, or you're going to hand me over to the Romans?" And so they handed him over to the Romans, and he went up to him and gave him his arms and said, "You have beaten me fair and square." And they took over France, and ever since after that, France was part of the Roman Empire. Those Gauls didn't have it in them anymore to mount a fight, and in the end, when it was all said and done, like I said, they had killed 1 million French, and so then that's when they repopulated all of the different towns with Roman soldiers and Roman garrisons, and repopulated them with Roman soldiers' families and all that kind of stuff, and brought Roman culture, Roman law, and Roman everything, and that was the end of Celtia, the nation of the Celts. But of course, so I don't know like what percentage of people were Roman after that. We automatically know that 20% population reduction in Celts, and then so then that got reinfused with 20% of Romans who are now the ruling class and probably had the money to have more kids. And so when it was all said and done, most of the people were still Gauls. They were still Celts. Like in the Roman Empire 100 years later, if you go up into Gallia, I'm sure that more people would be, the general people would be a lot taller and more blonde than down in Italy, but they would still be Romans. There'd be a lot of Roman stock too. So the same thing when the Franks invaded France. So if you look at French people today, their ancestors were the Celts for the most part, with some Romans, Italians and everything mixed in, but you can tell just by looking at people. If you look at Italians of today, they're generally going to be more dark skinned and dark haired than the French, and then the Germans even more so. But it's interesting if you trace history into the present day, where Belgium now is a country that speaks 3 languages: German, the language of the Dutch, Flemish, and French. Well, in those days, the land of Belgium was kind of half Germans, Germanic tribes, and then half like Celtic, tribes in there who were related to the Germans, and kind of like a mixed territory. And so then you trace it into the future, and then in the Dark Ages it was just a duchy that was controlled sometimes by the Empire of France, sometimes by the Germans, and now it's going to today, and it's still like that. So it's interesting that 2,000 years later, this legacy of just the characteristic, the genetic makeup of a country, and the language makeup of a country stays the same, throughout history. And just to trace something back is interesting. It's know how stuff sticks. And so after that, Julius Caesar went back to Italy and said, that's when he said, Vini, Vini, Victi. I came, I saw, and I conquered. And he was talking about the French. And then he had the civil war with the other Italians, Pompey, where he kicked Pompey's ass even though he was outnumbered, because all of his troopers were veterans of the Gallic wars. I mean, these guys were bad. All they knew was fighting and marching 20 miles a day and digging. And they were also they could dig a lot faster. For example, there was one example of a Celtic tribe trying to fortify one of their towns, where they dug a huge trench, just like the Romans did, that they learned from the Romans. And they made like a 13-mile, in circumference trench that was like 20 feet deep or whatever. And they did that in like a day or something. And so he's like, yeah, and that shows how many people there were. But he said that they did it without iron tools. They did it. So I guess a lot of those farmers, they were pretty primitive. They didn't have, not all of them had iron tools. They had like flint spades. And so yeah, Celts weren't all that, civilized. Like if you look at a Celtic city, it would be a dirt floored, thatched hut with a door that never closed. Same thing with the Celts, they're the people in Britain. With a low roof that they probably just had like a piece of skin covering the doorway, with just one room for the whole house. And the horses actually lived in the house with them in the same one room. And the houses were just kind of scattered out haphazardly with no roads or anything inside the town that was then surrounded by some wooden wall. Whereas in the Middle Ages in France, after the fall of the Roman Empire, or the Dark Ages, they had grid cities, with wooden buildings, but also stone churches and some stone buildings and stone walls instead of latticed wooden walls with rocks and dirt thrown on top of. And the horses lived in their own stables and that kind of stuff. He also mentioned the way that the Germans fought, because Rome also had Germans fight with them. He hired out Germans to fight, even in the times of Caesar. And the Germans kind of fought in their own way. The Germans had horses that were tiny little horses, but the horses were really strong because they had to run all the time. But when the Germans came up and fought, they didn't fight on horseback. They'd ride up to the battle on top of their puny little horses, and then jump off the horse and fight, and then jump back on the horse and get away. So yeah, the Germans weren't quite as technologically advanced in warfare, and that's why the Roman Empire eventually collapsed. It's because all those Germans eventually adopted the Roman way of fighting style, and those big groups in the scientifically fighting in giant tortugas and fighting in open fields, and riding on their horse and having cavalry divisions and archer divisions and all this kind of stuff. But back in those days, it wasn't really like that. German culture was totally different in those days. They had like a system of Wehrgeld. Like if somebody killed somebody, you would just instead of having like blood for blood or whatever, instead of killing him, you would just have him pay the family of the victim a certain amount of money, and then that was it. And that was kind of one reason that the Romans lost their province, because the Germans rebelled because they were pissed off that the Romans were punishing them by crucifying them instead of just doing their traditional Wehrgeld system, where they would just pay if there was a murder or something like that. So and the Germans were also a lot more more sexually stringent. Like they would stay, I don't know if stringent is the right word, they would stay with one woman the rest of their life, and it was easy that way because their life was so transparent. The little huts they made, they could look into the hut and see what was going on, and so they didn't even think about two timing or anything like that, and they were. They didn't do a whole lot of farming. I mean, they did farm, but only for like a year. And anyways, there's a book called Germanica by Cicero or somebody who wrote about it. And he wrote about it from stories he heard from Julius Caesar's troops and stuff. So anyways, that's the Gallic Wars, what I remember. It's really interesting if you look at France, all these towns that are mentioned in Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, they're actually the same name of the town is the name of the tribe in those days. Back in those days there were 50 different tribes throughout France, and those 5 million people. Each tribe would have maybe 50 towns or whatever, with one big town or a couple of big towns. But the towns that exist now were the capital of the tribes, named after the tribe. So if you have a town called Paris, that was named after the Parisi tribe, which was a tribe that existed in the Gallic times, who lived on the island in the Seine River right there in Paris. That was their stronghold. The town of I think there may be a town called Bibracte or whatever in France. Well, that was named after Bibracte. And if you look at the towns, you can see a road that goes around, and that's actually where the walls were. All these towns had walls. So exactly how big these towns were, and exactly how many people lived there, because Julius Caesar mentioned how many people were in the tribes and how many people lived in these towns. So you can look at, or go on Wikipedia and look at the population of one of these towns, and then look at the wall, which goes around pretty much all of these towns you can see, and then picture, what are the town, how many houses were there? If each house has 5 people, 5 divided by 40,000, then this is where the houses were. And somebody should actually draw up a little map of what the towns look like. I'd do it, but yeah, it's pretty fascinating to look at with Google Earth. And also, the mentions, what Julius Caesar mentions, this town had a hill. You can look at the hill. I mean, they found Alesia, and this town was between where the river snakes around, and you can see the town, all that kind of stuff. So it's really cool. Anyways, you can get it on bookshouldbefree.com. I'll put the link below. They read it to you and stuff. So, okay, peace out.